everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. I would imagine that most of us have been there. A Phish show where the first set gets off to a typical start, and then something happens, like maybe a bust out or a special guest, that makes the show instantly memorable before the set is even over. Or maybe a show where the weather takes a turn for the worse, and the show has to end early, or there's a downpour that's almost as memorable as the music. Well, today's guest, Ric Hickey, is here to tell us about a show that has both. July 1st, 1999 at the Starwood Amphitheater in Antioch or Nashville, Tennessee. When Phish comes to Nashville, it's not a given that there will be a special guest on stage, but the odds are in your favor. Ric tells us about seeing Phish in the early 90s around the Cincinnati area and various parts of Ohio, but also how he became familiar with the Nashville area and its music scene. The 1999 summer tour has been a really popular time to discuss on Attendance Bias, and Ric was there for the tour's first few shows in the Southeast. While he wasn't a bluegrass aficionado at the time, he was still impressed by the lineup of country royalty that joined Phish during the first set of this show for a mix of bluegrass standards and Phish originals. Then, a rollicking rainstorm caused an early end to the second set, leaving fans wet, muddy, disoriented, but hopefully satisfied. But we'll let Ric tell the story. So let's join Ric to talk about complex chord progressions in Billy Breathes, the short-lived DAT recordings, and what a dobro guitar sounds like as we discuss July 1st, 1999 in Nashville. Ric, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you doing?
Doing great, Brian. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm glad to have you here today as we dive back into 1999, the summer of 1999, and even more specifically, early July of 1999. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it seems to be a popular week for guests on Attendance Bias. And the show that we're going to discuss today, July 1st, 1999, at the Starwood Amphitheater in Antioch, Tennessee, which for all intents and purposes is Nashville, right?
Correct. Yeah. Just outside of the city.
Right. And I believe I recorded an episode with my friend Tom about the following year, which I think was June 22nd, 2000. I'll have to do a fact check on that. But It had a very similar feel to this show because I listened to this show for the first time ever in preparation of speaking to you.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because, of course, when they come to Nashville, there's so many musicians there and they've got to have numerous friends there. And the following year that you referred to, is that when they brought out Winona Judd?
Yes, to sing Freebird.
Yeah, which is classic.
Right, and she did it in recognition. I don't know the word she used, but in celebration or recognition that it was like a year since her divorce at the time. And she was I would guess, not 100% sober when she sang it, but she was having a good time.
Yeah. I wasn't there for that one, but I've listened to that performance and it's really good. I'm not the biggest Judd's fan, but of course they have some great songs. She has a hell of a voice. Yeah. And I remember being pleasantly surprised. I heard about that, so I went out of my way to find it and listen to it. And it's really good.
It is. So anyone listening, if you want to hear about after today's episode, if you want to fast forward approximately a year in the future, check out the episode where I speak about, or my friend Tom really speaks about, June 22nd, 2000 at, I believe, the same venue. I don't know if it was called the Starwood Amphitheater. I know it changes hands every now and again.
Yeah.
But it's the same venue with also guest stars. But we got a lot of guest stars to talk about today. Before we get to them, Ric, let's get to you with the Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Ric, when was your first Phish show, and what do you remember about it?
My first show goes all the way back to May 5th of 92 at Bogart's in Cincinnati, where I was born and raised, lived there most of my life. And I had been listening to the band for a year or so. I had a friend who had moved out to Colorado. And when he came back, I don't know if he came back to visit or if he had moved back home, but he had a cassette. He's like, you got to hear this band. And because we were big Zappa fans, and that's what really resonated with me, the humor and the improv and just the craziness of this band. Like, what is this band called Phish? In fact, the tape he had wasn't even labeled. It took us a while back then in those days before the internet and everything. it took us a while to even figure out that this was a dub of a dub of a dub, like, like you used to make a copy on your friend's boombox of
Right,
Lawn
but
Boy.
but no high speed dubbing,
That's
right?
right.
That's a cardinal sin.
That's a no-no. Yeah. Yeah, you're cutting into your sound quality pretty seriously when you're
Yeah.
high speed dub. But it turned out he had a copy of Lawn Boy, and from there I learned about the tape trading scene, just like how Phish heads were kind of picking up where the Dead had started this thing of allowing recording of their shows, and even the first few shows that I got a hold of weren't always labeled very well or very accurately. So, but yeah, May 5th of 92 was my first show at Bogart's in Cincinnati. It's about a 1,200 capacity club. It's still there. And in fact, by the end of the year, I saw them again December 3rd of 92.
And when people talk about Phish's history and certain cities where when they were getting out of the college Main Street bar
Hmm.
segment of their career around this time, right? When they were kind of jumping from clubs to theaters in
Yeah.
1992 and 1993, Cincinnati actually comes up quite a bit, right? There's a lot of well known shows. I can't remember the date right now. We had a guest named Kev Hollow who talked about the show where Phish played. It was in Cincinnati. I think it was the
Hmm.
Cincinnati Music Hall.
Yes.
And people were smoking so much that at the end of the first set or the beginning of the second set, it set off the fire alarm and everyone had to exit. And when they came back in, Phish played this Jimi Hendrix song, Fire.
Correct.
And they've also played great shows in Cincinnati later in 1.0. You and I off
Yeah.
mic, we're talking about 1.0 in 99, I think, was it, or 2000?
99. Yeah, that's right. There was a pair of shows in December that year that were phenomenal, but they had really become much bigger by then, playing the basketball arenas. I was going to say the main street in a college town scenario you mentioned is exactly what Bogarts was, and they did that twice in 92, and they were really jumping off from that to a larger venue at that point because in 93, early in 93, I caught a show at the Columbus and Newport, very similar, excuse me, at the Newport in Columbus, a very similar Main Street kind of bar. In fact, I saw the 4/21/93 show that the Split Open and Melt Jam was used for Demand on the Hoist record. Already by August of 93, they were playing an outdoor venue at the Cincinnati Zoo. And then, as you mentioned, the following year, June of 94, I think it was 6/21/94. You might double check me on that date. That music hall show, they got about 4 songs into it. Trey was doing the horse, and they never actually got to Silent in the Morning because he received word from, I don't know, the crew, the local authorities, whatever, that music hall was such an old building that the ventilation system was connected to the fire alarm, the smoke alarm. And there was so much smoking going on inside the venue that they actually had to evacuate, like you mentioned. So, and this whole show, I think, is on YouTube. I'm pretty sure, like an audience video. But yes, we evacuated everybody out onto the streets of downtown Cincinnati. And then at that time, Music Hall, the neighborhood around Music Hall was not great. Speaking as we were off mic about the gentrification of New York City, that area of Cincinnati is much nicer now than it was then. But everybody had to leave because legally you have to have a building completely empty so the fire marshal can say, okay, it's safe to bring everybody back in. Everybody was outside in like the worst neighborhood you can imagine, or going back to their cars or just smoking out on the street. And when they let everybody back in, they weren't checking tickets. So it really looked like a lot more people came back into the building than the people that had left. There was no way you were getting back to your reserved seat when we came back in. We just had to kind of fall into place somewhere. It was a phenomenal show, but you're right. That was that period where they were moving up from clubs to larger venues into theaters and things like that.
And fast forwarding a little bit, or maybe a lot, depending on your answer, what was the most recent Phish show that you've seen, and what did you think of it?
My most recent was in 2017, July 18th of 2017 at the Nutter Center in Dayton. I remember Peaches and Regalia in the first set and Ghost into Wombat in the second set were kind of highlights for me. There were 2 debuts that night with Tuesday and another song called Crazy Sometimes, I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yep.
I don't really consider those like top tier Phish songs, but a couple of debuts in one night. Of course, I think Tuesday was a Trey band song that Phish debuted that night. All in all, a pretty good show, but not the best show I've ever seen at Nutter Center. I was there for the legendary December 7th of 97 show. But basically, my daughter was born in 2018, so I haven't been to any shows since then. I'm strictly a couch tour guy now. I like to kick down for a webcast now and then. My heyday with the band is this era that we're talking about today, and that is back in the mid to late 90s. And I think in my notes I misspoke and said I went to like 40 or 45 shows. I think I was probably including a lot of like side projects, having opportunities to see, like the Jazz Mandolin Project or Trey Band and things like that. But yeah, my most recent show was 2017, and as I said, I love the fact that that the live Phish webcast technology allowed the band to finally catch up to the couch tour thing that fans were doing with cell phones in the crowd.
Right.
Even just 10, 12 years ago, there was a period when I was briefly living in Southern California, and I listened to the entire summer 2012 tour just by being online and scouring, message boards and stuff. Where is it tonight? Yeah, that's just been kind of fun to follow the couch tour going from some fans' cell phone in a pocket to the band actually saying, okay, here it is in high quality and you can download it and everything.
Right. And pay us for it.
Right. Of course. We're going to monetize this thing that you guys came up with.
Of course, is the natural order of things.
Yeah.
But that's pretty lucky though in 2017 that you caught one of the very few shows that's outside Madison Square Garden, because that was the summer or the year, you could say, of the Baker's Dozen. And there were like 4 shows, including one in Pittsburgh as well, that they played leading up to the Baker's Dozen. And I was one of those guys like you who was listening to those fan-fed streams, I guess you could say. And I had tickets. My first ticket for the Baker's Dozen was that Tuesday, July 25th, which was the jam-filled night. And when I was listening and I heard how good they were playing automatically, like right off the bat, I don't remember if it was the Nutter Center or if it was the Pittsburgh show. I just thought to myself, there are tickets available for the show before, which ended up being the Red Velvet night. And I said, why not? Why not? Like, they're too good. Why should I wait till Tuesday? I'll just get a ticket for Sunday. And man, so to those of you who were holding up your phones for hour and a half at a time, thank you for your service, because it brought me to one of the better shows I've seen.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That summer of 2012, we mentioned, again, off mic earlier, a couple attempts that I made to leave Cincinnati, and I always ended up moving back home. In 2012, I was in San Diego for a short time, and I did get to see a great show in Long Beach that summer. But I was basically following the tour thanks to those fans that were, out there, broadcasting it with their phones and listening every night. And I just thought they were incredible that summer. Like, every show was incredible. It was shocking how good, like, you would tune in and night after night, it was just incredible.
Agreed. Today's show, July 1st, 99, has a lot of sit-ins, a lot of guest stars, and we'll get into it a little bit later.
Yeah.
But sticking with the lightning round, if you could see any musical artist, whether living or dead, who has never sat in with Phish, so if your favorites have already sat in, sorry, they're off the table, but who would you choose, whether they're around or not?
I love this question. And when you sent it to me, I think I told you, like, my first thought was Frank Zappa, because he's my all-time favorite, like, number one musical hero. But he doesn't really collaborate in a traditional sense. I can't see him getting in there and like really weaving a sound with the band where they're all incorporating contributions to an improvisation. It would just be him kind of blasting one of his amazing guitar solos over a Phish vamp or groove or whatever, which would be phenomenal. But on my second thought was, I want to go with Eric Dolphy, a jazz musician from many years ago who worked with John Coltrane and a number of others, Charles Mingus, and of course made a lot of great records himself. The Out to Lunch record by Eric Dolphy is probably the place to start if you're not familiar. But he's one of those guys, anybody that has some familiarity with jazz, you have a musician or two or a vocalist or somebody whose technique, whose voice, whose method just really resonates with you. And Eric Dolphy is one of those guys that like everything I've heard that he's involved with, he just takes it to another level. So that's what I thought of after I like said, no, Frank would just make it all about Frank. Zappa would come out there and he's all ego and blast a great guitar solo that we'd all marvel at and everything. But I don't think it would be as interesting as having someone like we're about to talk about with this July 1st, 99 show, players that come out and weave into the fabric of the performance with everybody else, like I think the great Eric Dolphy would do, although he died many, many years ago.
Well, so any listeners, and I'm considering myself a listener in this case, I am not familiar with Eric Dolphy, so I know what I'm doing the rest of the day today.
Check out that Out to Lunch record is amazing. And I really think as a jumping off point for those of you that haven't heard, if you already like jazz and then you listen to that Out to Lunch record, I feel like your next move is going to be like, oh my God, what else is this guy on?
That's the best feeling in the world when you discover something new and then you find out there's a lot more to pick at.
I would be honored if I can facilitate that for anybody out there.
So today's show takes place in Antioch, Tennessee, but as we've discussed, it's really Nashville. Like, for example, Auburn Hills is really Detroit, we say, even though they're, about 40 minutes apart. It's kind of the main point when you talk about locations. Antioch is Nashville. So what is your favorite thing about Nashville, aside from the music, which I think most people use as the defining point of that city? What if we set the music aside? What else would you promote about Nashville if you were the tourism director of the city?
This was another question I loved seeing in the notes that you sent me in the email, because my dad's family is from just east of there in Wilson County. And I just have so many great memories of visiting them. And I have aunts and uncles and cousins there that I love them all dearly. So I have like a deep personal connection to that specific area in Tennessee. It is just outside of Nashville, but I mean, we used to go visit family, every summer, sometimes twice a year. And so I don't go anywhere when I'm heading south out of Ohio through Kentucky into Tennessee without feeling just deeply honored to be in that area, because my father and I were really close. His family is amazing. And aside from that, which is, a very personal thing to me, Nashville is just filthy with music history. I know you said for this question in particular, aside from the music, you know what I mean? You got to tour the RCA Studio B there because Elvis did so many legendary recordings there. You got to go to the Ryman, you know what I mean? Do the tour there twice, two different occasions. I was in Nashville and Ralph Stanley was playing at the Ryman. And so I just went. It was like a $25 ticket. I saw him there a couple of times. Saw ZZ Top there. That's probably one of the best venues in the country. And again, you wanted to, you said aside from music, what do you love about Nashville? But the Ryman is just as they call it, the mother church of country music. And Bill Monroe debuted there with the very first ever lineup of what we now consider kind of a classic bluegrass band with mandolin and guitar and fiddle. What can you say? Even though you asked me to steer clear of music, it's like, it's kind of hard.
You can't avoid it.
It's kind of hard to. But what's funny is for my 40th birthday, I went to Nashville and saw the Stray Cats and the Pretenders opening for ZZ Top. And looking back on that now, I realized that I was in the middle of my first marriage going down the shitter too. So it was like it was a solo trip, went down by myself, just like, as one does. What's going on within a day trip from here on my 40th birthday, and went down by myself, and it was an incredible show.
To wrap it up, as we do on the attendance bias lightning round, what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
Okay, well, very specific to the show we're going to talk about today, and that's probably why I picked the show, to be honest with you, because we've all seen nudity, bad trips, narcs, nitrous tanks, newbies puking in the parking lot hours before showtime. But, undertaking the firsthand experience of following the band, even if it's just for a long weekend here and there, you subject yourself to the whims of Mother Nature and unpredictable changes in the weather. As you said, this venue was like a 10-minute drive from Nashville, or just outside of Nashville, I should say. It was like a 10-minute drive from the campground that we chose near J. Percy Priest Lake. It's a giant man-made reservoir outside of Nashville, very close to this venue in Antioch, Tennessee. But it's surrounded by waterfront campgrounds, and I had been camping in that area many times before. But on the afternoon of the show, me and a friend of mine named Mike, hello, Mike, if you're listening, we found a great campsite right on the lake. And I remember setting up my tent about 30 feet from the water's edge. And Brian, you and I will get to a discussion about the concert itself in a moment here. But the most memorable thing about this evening for me was this storm that rolled in that night. It was clear late in the show that the band was wrapping up the show early because of the heavy weather. And as the crowd left the venue and streamed into the parking lot, the rain was coming down so hard you couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. I remember kind of lifting my t-shirt up over the top of my head and just kind of holding it out in front of me so that I could just see where I was going. It was just chaos. Like hundreds, you know how it is, thousands of us all looking for our cars in the rain or some kind of shelter from the storm that was rolling in and getting heavier. The lights in the parking lot, like the street lamp kind of lights in the parking lot, they cast this weird, sickly yellow glow over everything. I think that was one of the weirdest things about the scene. It just made it kind of look unreal. There were grassy hillsides on the perimeter of the parking lot as we were walking out. I remember seeing just like mud-soaked fans sliding down the hills in this tall grass in the mud. It was like a giant muddy slip and slide. People so covered with mud, they were just totally brown from head to toe. Some of them naked, of course.
Of course.
Of course. And I finally found the big red pickup truck that Mike and I had rented for the weekend, and I waited there for him. It took him like an hour, and the rain kept coming before he found the truck, that is. And we had dry clothes in the vehicle, so we changed right there in the parking lot without getting out of the truck. Finally got on the road, got back to our campground, and it was obvious almost right away that like the lake was rising. And I remember seeing my friends Jason and Esther were camping in the same campground where we were. And as Mike and I were kind of fighting through this shitstorm, driving back to our campsite, I remember glancing to my right and caught a fleeting glimpse of Jason and Esther kind of huddled under the covered truck bed in the back of their pickup. And they were just riding the storm out there. And I know, like I said a moment ago, that afternoon before the show, I had set up my tent like 30 feet from the water's edge. It was now like 10 feet from the water. Like, no kidding. It seemed like there was so much rain coming down that the lake was rising. No exaggeration. Like, rain had soaked my tent, everything inside it, wet pillow, wet sleeping bag.
Oh,
yeah. And I did my best to sleep under these conditions, but that storm kept raging into the night. It finally relented, and I actually got out of my tent and tried to sleep in the driver's seat of the pickup truck. Like, I feel like I can still hear the rain hitting the roof of the truck, you know?
And I have to ask, how old were you in the summer of 1999? Because I can't imagine someone my age, your age, in the present. It's let's just get in the car and drive until we see a motel. I don't care if it's 5 in the morning. Like, it's worth it. So only someone of a certain age would say, all right, let's just try and ride it out. So what was that certain age for you?
I was 31. This was a month before my 32nd birthday. So, you know, even for what is, you know, kind of the Phish crowd is maybe typically a little bit younger than that. Even then, I might have been like a little older than the average fan back then, you know. But I know I slept a couple hours in the truck, woke up with a headache. So I drove to like a convenience store, got some ibuprofen, drove back, slept a couple more hours in the truck. The next day was a travel day. There was no show that night.
Right.
But the recording, I feel like listening back to it, the recording doesn't really do that storm justice, because listening back to the show, you don't really get any sense of how powerful that rainstorm really was. It was scary, but it was fun. That's probably from being a little high. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
you're just you're riding the storm out, and you're just going to surf the chaos. And if the skies open up and it's, you know, raining like crazy, you just try to have a good time with it. But I remember thinking that it was one of the worst storms I'd ever seen in my life. And it just so happened to hit at a time and a place when I had nowhere to go but back to my tent. It was quite an adventure. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I do wonder sometimes if that second set And we'll get to a conversation about that. I do wonder if it would have maybe been a little different if the storm had passed or had gone around us or something. We'll see and talk about You Enjoy Myself being played third in the second set. Yeah, that would normally indicate a definite jumping off point for a monster jam. But I think there would have been at least one or two more songs in that second set, maybe even a totally different encore, if that weather hadn't taken a turn for the worse. But on the one hand, you can hear from the recording, that crowd was definitely demanding an encore. But on the other hand, folks in that very same crowd were putting themselves in jeopardy by not seeking shelter immediately.
Right, they ended up all muddy.
Yeah, I mean, all of us. There was nobody that got out of there dry at all. And as I said in the notes that I sent back to you in the email, attendance bias itself is rooted in our firsthand experiences. And this was a night that was memorable for me, not just because of the music, which was great. And it was the beginning of an epic weekend, kind of mini tour through the South. And as I said, we were on our way to those amazing Atlanta shows too.
When was this show played?
Taking a look at the summer of 1999, especially this July, in the whole month, Phish played 20 shows in the summer of 99. This was the second show of the whole tour. The previous one was in Bonner Springs, and then they had a night off. This show, and then as you just mentioned, they resumed the tour with this legendary two-night stand on July 3rd and 4th at the Lakewood Amphitheater in Georgia. Then we would go north for a week, and this is usually the week that gets all the hot presses, I think starting with Georgia, but Camden, Holmdel, and Great Woods. I don't know if it's because I grew up in the Northeast and met a lot of my Phish friends in the Northeast, but this week of July 4th through 13th, I guess, would be a fair excerpt, is kind of the stuff that people talk about and their eyes glaze over in a good way with ultimate nostalgia.
Yeah.
And so you picked a show that, at least in my experience, my limited bubble as a Phish fan, is kind of the pretext to that. It should be noted that this tour was the first time in a really long time that Phish switched up their positions on stage. It also had always been four across, but for the summer 99 tour, Fishman moved behind Mike and Trey, more like a traditional rock drummer, as the band got a little more beat centric. And when I say that, I think I'm thinking of a lot of Tab songs, like Got a Jaboo or First Tube, that where Mike and Fishman don't have to change what they're playing for 9 or 12 or 15 minutes straight.
Yeah.
And so to have a more traditional setup physically for a rhythm section made sense at the time. Trey also added a small keyboard setup that you could hear in almost every single show from this summer.
Yeah.
And also during one of my first interviews of this podcast, I'm talking about 5 years ago, a friend of mine chose the show at Merriweather Post. So just a couple days before this show, it was a running joke about how a couple days after this show, it was a running joke at the time, I'm talking about in 2020 with my friend Tom, that 1999 was kind of an underrepresented year, that everyone loves 97. 98 was kind of a compounding part of 97, that the band was kind of an in-between from rhythm funk into 1999 ambience, and then 98 was kind of the middle summer of covers, for example, that fell over into the fall.
Yeah.
And 1999 though was kind of an in-between. But by now, after however many episodes of this podcast, I think it's closer to 200 now, there have been at least 10 episodes about full shows or jams from 1999, 6 of which are from the summer. A couple are from the December tour they did that year leading up to Big Cypress. I think all of the ones in the summer are from the first 2 weeks of July.
Yeah.
So I'm going to hand it over to you. What do you think it was about July 1999 that Phish either just caught fire or at least is so compelling to people? Is it a matter of just demographics of the podcast guests that come on here? Or is it something about their sound, something completely different? What are your thoughts on it, Rick?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts actually listening to you just now, because 1999 was a banger. And this is especially remarkable when you consider that they didn't play at all in the first half of the year.
Right.
You know,
This was Trey's first solo tour.
correct. Yeah, which I saw in May 4th, I think, of that year. I caught him in Indianapolis. But yeah, and another thing I thought of while you were talking there is that, a lot of times when tour dates are announced and they're coming to our area, maybe the fifth or sixth night of the tour is closest to your part of the country. Oh, they'll be great by then. Not that you don't want to see the first or second night of the tour, but after they've been on the road for almost a week, they're starting to warm up and loosen up a little bit. You can kind of be a little more optimistic that they're getting in the groove. The jams are going to be a little more interesting, whatever. But here we're talking about the second night of the tour, the second show of the year.
Right.
This July 1st show in Nashville. But to answer your question, I think it could possibly be a coincidence related to demographics. All the 99 shows that people want to discuss on the show, especially if your interview subjects are all around the same age, they would share a lot of memories from roughly the same era in Phish's career. But personally, I think the band had just been so strong in 97, like you mentioned, and in 98, that they were like playing at a fever pitch by the summer of 99. And I feel like the crowds were just throwing gas on that fire. They sounded to me more so than ever that summer. They sounded to me like a hard rock band. I'm thinking specifically of the version of Wilson that they played in Atlanta. I mean, Trey's always got an occasion to step on the distortion pedal for Chalk Dust Torture or something like that. But that Wilson, I don't know if I've heard a heavier version than the one they did in Atlanta just a couple days after this. The accepted narrative and popular opinion, like you were just saying, 97 was funk, 98 was kind of covers, and they're moving into that kind of ambient sound. And I don't even know if I personally subscribe to that, if that's an oversimplification or not. But I don't think I certainly didn't expect 99 to be almost like a heavy metal Phish after what the previous 2 years had been like. They always had their ballads and humor and, the jazzy flourishes. But this version of Phish that summer seemed like edgy and kind of raw. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there are moments in this Nashville show, like I said a moment ago, that kind of reminded me of Deep Purple. There were some moments in the second set, some of the jams got kind of ugly and murky, and it just kind of put me in that state of mind, like a 70s kind of hard rock band that, there were a lot of bands back then that jammed. If you've ever heard Deep Purple's Made in Japan, or there's a lot of examples I could cite before they really talked about jam bands per se. The Dead and the Allman Brothers weren't called jam bands back then, but we know what they were doing. Yeah, there's something about Phish that summer. It just seemed like they were just raging like a forest fire.
And I think the show, at least during this summer, that clicks and kind of checks all those boxes that you were describing just now would be the Oswego Festival.
Mm-hmm.
A while ago, I talked with my buddy Dave about Oswego, and there's a version of Piper from Oswego that I think I described it as a supersonic wormhole.
Yeah.
That it's just endless guitar, like pedal to the metal. Like it never, ever stops. And to me, I always considered, because at the time that I first listened to it with Dave, I was kind of 1999 delinquent. I didn't know a lot. I just kind of, to your word, I generalized about their sound, about their overall sound. And I realized they can get kind of mushy and dark and murky, like you said, or they could be a straightforward heavy rock band that you've never heard hit you so hard. And going from the that famous Chalk Dust Torture, was it in Camden? I think this summer that people just go nuts over, rightfully so. One of the best jams they've ever played. So 1995 is Two Sides of a Pancake, talking about your whiskey breakfast.
Yeah.
They could be murky and weird, or they could be straightforward and rocky, or a lot of places in between.
Yeah. And, for me personally, I mean, I don't mind the like happy, hippy dippy noodle dance, Phish jams, but when they get really dark, that's my wheelhouse. That's the shit I pay for. I love that, And 99, not to say that anybody slept on it or that you and I are talking about a year that no one else ever talks about, but to your point about how it's a running joke in some circles, or at least as you were referring to, how 99 isn't anybody's favorite year, but the band has released several shows from that summer on livephish.com as downloads or whatever. And that Camp Oswego Festival is incredible.
Set 1.
So let's dig into this show. It opens with Punch You in the Eye, the opener of openers, especially in late 1.0. And there's obvious huge cheers from the crowd. The recording that I listened to for this episode was quite good because a lot of late, and I've said this a billion times on this podcast, a lot of late 1.0 shows aren't that good when it comes to the recording. Like, that's why I love that they've released so many soundboard recordings of these shows, and it just gets everyone over and into it. And instead of pushing it up another notch like they typically do, right, power opener and then another rocker before they go into a ballad, they kind of switch it up. It goes from Punch You in the Eye and then straight into Billy Breathes.
Yeah.
Like a strange 1-2 opener.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that recording sounds amazing too. It's funny referring as we were earlier in this conversation to those days when we traded cassettes and stuff. Late 90s, how many people were still recording on cassette, or some were going over to DATs? Remember when the DATs were kind of the go-to? If you're bringing in your tape deck and your microphones, there was a period there where there were a lot of pros and cons to cassettes, an analog cassette versus a DAT. And I think that affects the quality of these recordings when we listen back to them. I think the cassettes end up sounding a lot better just because the analog seems to represent a lot more full kind of frequency range or whatever. But like you said, that opener, the Punch opener, was incredible, very well played. Kind of like you mentioned, a surprise, dipping into more of a slow kind of ballad thing with Punch is a personal favorite of mine. And I had tickets in hand to see 6 shows that July. Later in the month, I went to Polaris Amphitheater, which they also released, the 7/23/99 show, and both shows at Deer Creek, including the 7/25/99 show that's just insane. This is way overdue for official release. It's one of the best shows I think they've ever played. But on this night to open, the first of what I knew I was going to see 6 shows in that month, to open with Punch You in the Eye, I was very pleased with that because that's a favorite song of mine. They played it really well. I was a little worried about Billy Breeze. It's like they don't always get it right. There's something about that.
It's hard. It's a hard song.
It is. And I think there's something about that chord progression at the end with Trey soloing over it. And they almost always screw it up. And I know that night I was kind of waiting like, are they gonna get through this? And they did. But it was interesting, and with the Punch opener followed by Billy and Coyote, which we'll talk about. With the Punch opener, you get, I think in my notes I called it Funky Phish, but there's a lot more going on in Punch You in the Eye than just funk. But it's kind of like everything Phish does kind of crammed into one song, but I love it. But you get Funky Phish, Ballad Phish, and then in the Coyote with Prog Phish, kind of a progressive rock thing. So your Nashville crowd is getting this amazing cross-section of the band's diverse repertoire in just those first 3 songs. And regarding this first set, it's only the first 3 songs that are just Phish. The 7 remaining tunes in the first set all featured special guests. And I don't know, we'll have to maybe do a fact check or something, but maybe the highest number of songs in a set with a special guest for many years.
I'd have to check that. The only thing that comes to mind as we're speaking in real time would be very recent when Billy Strings came out at
Yeah.
Grand Rapids in the
Yeah.
summer of 2024. That's kind of the only possible ratio that I could think of.
Yeah.
Either that or maybe Derek Trucks, a couple, I think it was last year or 2 years ago in Georgia, perhaps. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the number of special guests is just mind blowing as you're listening, and it almost doubles the band.
And on this night it did, because by the end of the first set there were 8 people up there.
Right.
But in the to my point about the just seeing the core foursome of Phish, that second set, which we'll get to, it's only 3 songs plus an encore. So when you think about it, you only get that core foursome for half a dozen, maybe 7 songs all night. But Punch was great. Billy Breeze was played incredibly well. A pleasant surprise for me, as someone who I'm almost always expecting that to just go off the rails at the end. But on this night, it was just beautiful.
I agree with you. And in Billy Breathes, what really grabbed my attention, even though I love Trey's composed guitar solo at the end, because when they play it live, it's one of the few solos that he sticks to. Because the album version, the guitar solo on the album is so well composed. He or they, whether it was Steve Lillywhite and Trey or just Trey and the band, obviously put a lot of effort into the arrangement of that solo and the chord progressions, as you mentioned. It's a complex song. He nails it. Just the same, Page has a piano solo at about 2 minutes that just really grabbed my attention, my emotional attention while I was listening. Like, what an achievement it is to be followed by that composed guitar solo. And then Gaiute, which was played 20 times in 1999. So it was hard to avoid if you were going to any number of shows. But at this point, it's played perfectly compared to the album version. And it's either, depending on your point of view, it's either an exciting composition in the middle of the first set, or it's a 10-minute bathroom break.
Yeah, and I think when they nail it, and I'm not one of these guys that talks a lot about like placement, like, oh, they put it in just the perfect part of the set or whatever. I don't really think in those terms. I just kind of go with the flow and then later look back and decide if I agree with the flow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But Gaiute, excuse me, in this case, they played it incredibly well. It's just an insane piece of music. I'm not telling you or your listeners anything you don't know. That middle section, especially, and 99, that was still a pretty new song. So to hear them go into it, even though, yes, they were playing it a lot, I don't think anybody was disappointed. Like, oh shit, it's Gaiute. I think it might have, to your point, it might have reached a point sometime later where like, let's run to the bathroom, grab a beer, and then we'll come back for that crazy section or whatever. But on this night, they just crushed it, and I think one of the things I've always enjoyed about that song, especially that insane middle section, it so often feels to me like holding it together is just beyond their grasp. It like snowballs and spirals and rages, and the band and all of us in the crowd were just like hanging on for dear life. And it finally climaxes and comes back down to earth with that eerie vocal section towards the end, the bouncing like a newborn elf.
Bouncing like a newborn elf, I can't remain inside myself. Gaiute glances in my eyes and manages to hypnotize me as I sleep the sleep of death.
And everybody in the place, you can hear it. This is one thing you can hear on the recording. It sounds like 15,000 people trying to catch their breath. Like oh shit, what was that? Like we all just got off the roller coaster at the same time, and I can't imagine it's an easy song to play. It must have taken them forever to work it out. I went through a couple different arrangements, I think, even on stage. And I'm sure that
it debuted in October of 94. October 7th, 1994. And then they were like tinkering with it. They would play it now and again. And then it like took like a 7-month break. Like it was off the
Yeah.
stage for 7 months. And then I think it was Halloween 95, a little bit over a year later. It was when they played Quadrophenia
Okay.
that they played it in the form that we know today.
Yeah, and I'm sure when it comes off insanely good like it did on this night, the guys in the band are just as drained as we are. They got to be relieved to just have survived the ride, because it really builds and builds and builds, and they have to concentrate so hard to play a piece of music like that. And they don't really have a lot of stuff, I'd say, in the second half of their career that really approaches that kind of orchestrated, really complicated, music like they had so much of in their early days. But this one in particular, when they really nail it, they got to be up there just like us, trying to catch their breath. And I think I mentioned in my notes too that like I'm picturing those Nashville cats by the side of the stage waiting for their turn. They're waiting for their turn to come out and sit in on a few tunes. And the band's playing Gaiuti. Those guys have got to be thinking like, holy shit, what's going on out there? Because I mean, you and I know the level of musicianship in Phish is just insane. And you could say the same thing about like the community of musicians in Nashville, Tennessee. But there's not a whole lot of crossover until Phish comes to town. You know what I mean? So they know these guys. They're all acquainted, but you still have to figure those guys are on the side of the stage like, "Oh my God, what was that?"
Yeah.
That's not, if you want to do Uncle Pen, count it off. I'm ready. But when they go into Gaiuti, there's got to be guys, even, Tim O'Brien and these other guys that were guesting that night, they, Ronnie McCurry and Jerry Douglas, and we'll get to that, their sit-ins later in this set. But even those guys, the serious Nashville cats, they're standing there just like with their jaws on the ground.
And they don't have to stand there for very much longer because after Gaiuti is over,
Here we
Trey
go.
says, "Thank you. We're so happy to be here." And he mentions how many great musicians there are in Nashville. And then he introduces Jerry Douglas for Wolfman's brother. And Jerry Douglas
Yeah.
plays a dobro, which is what I pictured in my head. I was glad to do a quick Google and I was right. It's that specific type of guitar that has the metal back, like behind the strings, behind the center of the
Yeah.
strings. And
It almost looks like a hubcap.
yeah, it does. It does. And it's especially resonant. It
Yeah.
almost to me has like this Australian kind of sound. The
Like a didgeridoo.
like a didgeridoo. It kind of has like
Yeah.
wow, wow, wow. Like
Yeah.
it's not a straightforward pluck the string, you hear that note kind. You have to be really
Yeah.
skilled to know how to play it. And they play it on Wolfman's brother. And Jerry Douglas obviously was practiced or was familiar with the song because you could hear it immediately. My first note was, "This is funky country."
Yeah, and at this point in the night, I mean, I think when you're in Nashville, how many of us are thinking like, I wonder if they're going to have any special guests? It wasn't on my mind at all. I knew I was just outside of Music City, very familiar with the area, and its history, but I wasn't sitting there thinking like, who are they going to bring out? And it turns out even when they bring out Jerry Douglas, you don't know that's just the beginning of like a parade of
Yeah.
special guests coming out. And aside from Gaiuti, this is probably my favorite highlight from that first set. Those two songs played back to back, they're like a mountainous peak in that first frame. And on paper, it might look like the fireworks were just getting started, but Jerry Douglas owns this Wolfman's. He plays tastefully, never overreaching or hot dogging it. I don't know him personally, but it almost feels like someone weaving their personality into the performance. And Trey's giving him a lot of room, lots of room to groove. The two guitars, as different as they are, they don't crowd each other at all. I think both of them are playing real tastefully, not underplaying, but just careful to not overdo it, not to crowd the other guy. I think it doesn't go on as long as some of my favorite Wolfman jams tend to do, but it definitely stands as a totally unique version of the tune. And it feels like you can actually hear how excited and honored that the band felt having Douglas out there on stage with them. They just kind of stand back and let him shine.
I agree, because the best sit-ins, in my opinion, the best sit-ins bring out the best in the band, but they also make something old sound new. So Wolfman's Brother is generally, I think, considered more of like a funky song due to its position as a vehicle in 97 in the famous March 1st show in Germany that's been released on Slit, Stitch, and Pass, where it was kind of the catalyst for the funk, the cow funk movement. But in this case, which is years after that, it sounds like it could be a country song. And how often would you categorize Wolfman's Brother as a countrified song?
It's insane.
A lot of guests are controversial among Phish fans. A lot of people say, I paid to see Phish, but I almost always love them because of what I said. They bring out different sides of the band and they make what's familiar a little bit different. This isn't quite a slide guitar, but that's the closest I could come when I was doing my initial listen. Like, I've never heard Wolfman's with this kind of sound before, and this sit-in makes an old song sound new, and you can't ask for more than that.
Yeah, truth. I mean, it really speaks to the consummate professionalism of Jerry Douglas. He's not just a great player, but he's not coming out there just to wail. He's gonna do his part to elevate the piece, and he knows instinctively that doesn't mean I got to play a lot of really fast notes really loud. And to your point about sit-ins, I think you're right. Some people dislike them, or they're considered controversial in some circles. It's not my favorite thing. I think this is kind of an exception for me, though, because sit-ins rarely produce a performance that I want to go back to again and again to listen to. And this one I definitely do. I mean, there's Wolfmans that are longer, that are maybe might even rank a little higher on my list of personal favorites, but this is totally unique. And what he does, it's like acoustic slide guitar, but it has a fuller sound. You're right to your reference to like an almost Australian, or it's like this unknowable kind of quality that takes Wolfman's in a direction that no other version goes there.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
And sit-ins aren't always, as I said, they're not always a repeated listen experience for me. Like I think it was December of 96, and Les Claypool was on the Encore in Vegas, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Where the Encore turns into almost like a third set, and it's crazy and it's super enjoyable. but I don't go back and listen to that very often like I might this, and that's all a matter of opinion, of course. But I think I mentioned that in my notes too, that like the sit-ins tend to dilute what I came to see and hear when Phish really jams and gets expansive and goes dark and gets weird and ambient and takes me somewhere mentally and emotionally and psychologically that I've never been before. That doesn't really happen when there's a fifth or sixth, player on this. It's those four guys that conjure this thing that I paid to see, but this was an exception because I wasn't complaining that night. And
Yeah.
as we'll see, it was just the beginning of a number of really classy players that just elevated everything that they played on for the rest of this set.
Right. At the end of Wolfman's Brother, Trey introduces Ron McCurry on mandolin and Tim O'Brien on fiddle. They play two classic bluegrass songs, Beauty of My Dreams and Doing My Time. There's a big crowd cheer for Beauty of My Dreams, and I love this. I've said it before. I would love a tour where Phish plays like a first acoustic bluegrass set. I would be interested
Yeah.
to hear how it's received.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful short fiddle solo at about 1 minute and 20 seconds of Beauty of My Dreams. It's a song that's pretty much never left Phish's repertoire since it was introduced. And Doing My Time, which I recognized from an album called The Three Pickers. It was released in 2003. So to me, it was interesting to recognize a Phish cover when knowing the original version that was released 4 years after Phish first
Yeah.
covered it. It was kind of like the past catching up to the future for me. This is the first version of this song in 192 shows. The last version was played August 7th, 1996 at Red Rocks, and that time also was with Tim O'Brien.
Yeah.
And it had a very interesting slowdown to end that song. So kind of a classic bluegrass pairing right in the middle, in the heart of this set with the guests.
Yeah, bringing out O'Brien and McCurry for a Beauty of My Dreams, I think what you end up with is one of the best versions of that song that they've ever played, and Douglas makes a great contribution to that one too. Doing My Time, it must be something of a signature song for Tim O'Brien because the version they played on this night and the other one that you just referred to are just amazing. I think I refer to it as a tempest in a teacup because he has just a really commanding performance there where you could tell he knows that song inside and out, and it's really, really good.
I like that after Beauty of My Dreams and Doing My Time, they play a relatively new Phish song, Rogue, which is pretty interesting because you wonder how much are any guests willing to learn before they agree to come on stage with Phish, or I don't know in what order that conversation goes, how the set list kind of pans out. But Rogue, most fans, I would guess, at this show maybe haven't heard it live yet, depending on how frequently they see Phish. So I like that the guests are staying on for a relatively new original song instead of just playing, like I just said, a bluegrass set where everyone would know every song.
Yeah, totally. Rogue was very new at that time, and it also speaks to the professionalism and the consummate musicianship of these Nashville cats that they brought out. You could throw something at them that's not a traditional bluegrass tune, and that's not like a gaiuti with like elaborate chord changes or any insane arrangement that's impossible to follow. Maybe they ran through it at sound check or something like that. Maybe not. You got guys out there playing with you that you tell them what key it's in, you count it off, and they're fine. if I have one complaint with this part of the set, it's that much of this kind of sit-in section is a little too tentative for my taste. I feel like only occasionally one of the players will step up and really let it rip. Like I said, Tim O'Brien and Doing My Time, he just wails on that. It's incredible. And with Fishman kind of driving the train, it really is an incredible performance. But after Beauty of My Dreams, which is amazing, that Tim O'Brien showcase of Doing My Time, this Roquet, I felt like it had some really nice dreamy textures, and I don't want to say it suffered or that it's bad, because it really wasn't by any means, but everybody's kind of playing very tentatively, and that might speak to their professionalism, and they're just trying to listen more than they're actually playing. Like I said, it has some dreamy textures, but not much else.
Well, I think they do get a lot more comfortable with the next song. They play Water in the Sky, which not unexpected. I remember the original version of this song toward the end of 97 was more of like a slow honky tonk song. So it kind of fits this Nashville inspired version. I don't know if I'd call Water in the Sky bluegrass, but it certainly has more in common with bluegrass than Roguet does, for example. And this is where what you were talking about happens, where different members of the band, the expanded band on stage, kind of step out while the rest of the band just vamps. So there's a mandolin solo at 1 minute and 15 seconds, and then a fiddle solo at 2.5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful and it's very fun. I wanted to ask you if you remember. The answer, I don't remember, is obviously acceptable. This happened 26 years ago. But do you remember what the feeling or vibe in the venue was like during this? Because now we're, 4, 5 songs into this like closed off bluegrass mini set within the larger context of a Phish show. And I don't know how many people around are into that, expecting that, happy about that, or they just want to get back to Phish.
You know what's funny is like I'm not a dancer, and I find a Phish show like I do a little side to side sway. I got my eyes closed here and there. I don't dance, but like I'm an observer of like all the different. We know what the crowd looks like when they go into Poor Heart. They're dancing a little differently than when they go into You Enjoy Myself, for example. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm sure I don't have for you a specific recollection of that night, but I do remember the energy there, like when the Nashville Bluegrass All-Stars were coming out for one song after another, there definitely was a feeling you knew you were seeing and hearing something special, So the vibe in there, was it a hoedown? It's about to be with Poor Heart. You know what I mean? It really kicks into high gear to close out that first set. But there was just a vibe that like, okay, this can only happen here. If you're in Bonner Springs, Kansas, or Cincinnati, Ohio, you don't get Tim O'Brien and Jerry Douglas and, this, as you said, kind of a contained little bluegrass time set in the middle of the show. But there was definitely a feeling that, like, something was unfolding in front of you that doesn't happen anywhere else. And that, as the summer tour was just beginning, it wasn't going to happen anywhere else.
Well, don't get to Poor Heart to close the set yet, because before that is Back on the Train.
Yeah.
And when I started listening to it, I already loved it because, again, this idea of listening to a show that happened after this first, right? So this version of Get Back on the Train happened before the one I'm going to reference, but I heard the later one first. So the version, again, at Oswego a couple weeks later had Del McCoury, or the Del McCoury Band, guesting with them on Get Back on the Train, which is one of my favorite versions ever, because, again, I don't consider Get Back on the Train a country song, but when it's played a certain way and when you add certain instruments and a certain type of groove to it, all of a sudden it becomes one, like Wolfman's Brother. There's a fiddle solo at about 1:20 with a similar jam outlay to Rogue, where the band just kind of keeps the groove going underneath and no one really steps out to lead. Eventually, it just kind of quiets down toward the end before the song simply like vanishes or stops. That was a little strange.
Yeah, it's a weird ending to that one for sure. But, as you were referring to Water in the Sky a moment ago and how its arrangement was kind of evolved, its early versions were like a slow country tune. And then it turned into Fishman really tinkered with the beat there and made it what it is now. And on this night, it feels almost like a transitional version. It's not what it used to be, and it's not quite what it will become. These other players out there, that was perfectly suited to this selection of guest musicians on stage with them. And I will respectfully disagree with you about Back on the Train, because I really feel like that is a country song. And, you and I read and hear about and discuss with our fishy friends the cow funk of 97 and how the band will still touch on that. And when they have a really good night, it's when they dip, deep into the cow funk. But I've never really fully understood where that phrase came from. And then you hear something like Back on the Train. It's funky, but it has a little country in it. Fishman's doing that beat on the snare drum that is almost like a Johnny Cash kind of shuffle, I will say.
Yeah.
As a guitarist and a performing and recording artist myself, Back on the Train has been in my solo acoustic set for years, because you could do kind of a Johnny Cash kind of version of that, So I think it's not a country song. It just isn't, but it doesn't surprise me that you bring players like this out and they know exactly what to do with it. They fit right in there. They find their place and they fit right in.
And then they do close the set with Poor Heart, which is a straightforward bluegrass song. And I wonder how all of these bluegrass experts feel about playing this song. That, to me, I won't use the word amateur because that has that negative connotation, but it doesn't have the weight that, say, Doing My Time does. The authenticity, I guess I could say, which
Yeah.
has been a rag on Phish for most of their career.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I hate to find myself repeating it, but
Yeah.
I still think that way when I hear this after all those other songs. But we have a new guest again, Gary
Yeah.
Gazaway on trumpet.
Yeah.
And that comes out of nowhere. I didn't look ahead at the set list ahead of time. So when I hear it, I'm like, whoa, what? And then
Yeah.
everyone gets involved at about
Yeah.
3.5 minutes. It's like the big finale. It is the big finale of the set, not the show, but of
Yeah.
this segment of the show.
It really does rage it. And I'll tell you, speaking of recollections from that night, that they didn't introduce Gary Gazaway. I think that they just knew they were going to bring him out to close out that first set with Poor Heart. And you're a minute or so into it. And I remember being out on the lawn at the show and like, I think I hear like, it's pretty clear that there's a trumpet, and the stage is so crowded at that point. Like, oh yeah, yeah, I'm out in the lawn. You're far enough away that like, you're still trying to ascertain like there's 6, 7. No, there's 8 guys up there. You know what I mean? And yes, I hear a trumpet. For his part, this set has been elevating ever since Wolfman's. It's kind of ramping up with the players, and even though I don't feel like the Roguet or Water in the Sky are the best versions I've ever heard, there's like an energy and a vibe that's ramping up. And Gazaway's trumpet kind of like cuts through everything that preceded and elevates this final song of that first set to a higher energy level. And I've said before, as I said it a few minutes ago, I'm not the biggest fan of guests on stage with them, but like it really elevated here. It was just like, you can hear it if you listen to the recording. They're just raging. And it does get to a point where it seems like, okay, this guy's taking a solo. Okay, now he's stepping back so that guy can take a solo. But there's more than once in that song where like, oh shit, they're all going off.
Yeah, everyone gets
like,
involved.
Yeah, they don't like wait for their turn and nobody's really stepping on other people's toes or anything like that. But like they're all just like, let's just go for it. It's phenomenal.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
The second set opens with Down with Disease, and we talked a little bit earlier in this episode that we know ahead of time, we did not know at the time, or you didn't know at the time, that this was going to be a truncated set. It is, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, 55 minutes, 3 songs, half of which is You Enjoy Myself, which lasts about 28 minutes. But it opens with no indication of that with Down with Disease. There's no guests on stage. was it raining when the set started, or did it begin to rain during the song? Because the Phish.net jam charts that I love reading, and I know some of the guys who work on the Phish.net jam charts,
Yeah.
some of them have been on this podcast. It reads, quote, as if playing to extinguish the pouring rain, Trey's soloing is incendiary, a sort of in-your-face jamming possibly unparalleled. The jam isn't totally absent nuance, however, and play cools to become a bit introspective before the band nimbly works toward the song's conclusion and segues into Prince Caspian. So
Yeah,
was
and
it raining during the set break or at the beginning of the song? Like, how did this all unfold?
first of all, that's a beautiful synopsis and very well written, and it was. I feel like that was one of those nights where, like, you know what those summer nights feel like when the wind is blowing in a certain way, and it feels like, you know, this old expression, like it wants to rain.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
and when it's getting dark out, you can't really gauge what the clouds are looking like. But I seem to recall that it was like you get a little drizzle and it would pick up and then it would die out. It would pick up, it would die out. And you just have that feeling like, you know, I hope it doesn't get crazy. You know, where anytime you go to an outdoor concert, like you're thinking about the weather, you know, how can you not, you know, just like that first set that like we didn't know what was coming. Oh, it's Jerry Douglas. Oh, it's Tim O'Brien, you know, and it just ramped up in its own way and became this amazing and wonderful thing that it was. That second set, we didn't know what was coming. You know, I feel like during Down with Disease, I feel like the rain was kind of off and on throughout that second set. The rain was rolling in and you just got your fingers crossed, like I can handle a little bit of this. It would come and go through that second set. And that Down with Disease jam, and I'll tell you, that's not my favorite Phish song. You know, I said earlier that I'm not the biggest fan of this hippy dippy happy jam band thing. 1,000 barefoot children dancing on my lawn. Like, I'm okay. You know, let's get to the jam. You know what I mean? Even that like swirling murky noise when they come out with the second set, you know, oh, this is Down with Disease. I'm not bumming. I'm not upset. You know, I might actually, oh, you know what? I've got 5 minutes to go get a beer while they sing verse, chorus, and I'll come back for the jam because Down with Disease, never a big favorite of mine, is a reliable springboard for a jam. I mean, every time they play it. And on this night, like listening back to the show in preparation for this podcast, I was listening back to that. Like, I cannot believe how good that version is because the jam just gets so gnarly, like more than once. It's just so chaotic. It feels like it goes off the rails and they pull it back in and it gets into that dark ambient kind of sludge that I like. I like that, like being knocked off my axis. Like I'm sure what's happening here, you know, and where they're going and what they're doing. And
there are some jams that when I'm taking notes as I listen in preparation to talk to someone about it, where I start doing timestamps. Right. Yeah. And there's an occasional jam that as I'm typing, I have to glance up, see what time it is, and then the related comment I have about it. And it seems like eons have passed between the way the band is playing in one part, and then they kind of transition to another part of the jam. And in these particular jams, and this Down with Disease is one of them, it's every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes, there's somewhere else. So, for example, I wrote that there's, in capital letters, big time guitar fireworks at 8 minutes and 20 seconds. something else, effects laden guitar and minor key jamming. And I looked up, now it's 12 minutes.
Yeah.
Like really squeezing everything out of this jam. I look up, it's 14 minutes. And
Yeah.
it just seems like every 2 minutes, this Down with Disease is entering a different dimension. And I'm
Yeah.
loving it the more and more it plays.
Yeah, it's incredible. I don't want to drop a bad pun in here, but like time turns elastic when they're really in that space. You feel like eons have passed, and you're just in this other universe where like time feels different. It feels different, and they go from this thing to some totally different thing within the span of a couple of minutes, and that's why we're talking about them. It's otherworldly what they do when they let themselves go into that space, those scary kind of dark ambient soundscapes. That's my wheelhouse, and they don't really go there frequently enough for my taste. I like that sense of just being unsure of like time, space, and dimension. Like what is going on right now? And
Well, they did that a lot in the summer of '99, as we discussed earlier. Like this is the wheelhouse.
Yeah, totally.
And they do, for what it's worth, they do bring it back to the Down with Disease coda at the very end. I did not expect this. I thought this was just going to segue somewhere or peter out like some of the songs in the first set did. But they do close it, which, I don't know. I think of gymnastics routines in the Olympics when everyone always talks about the landing, sticking the landing.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's a commonly overused metaphor, but to me, when they kind of organically find the end of the song, especially a big jam like this, that's like 18 minutes or 20 minutes, and they do, to me, that brings it up to a 10 as opposed to like an 8.5. If I'm one of the judges judging one of those Eastern Europeans jumping off the high beams or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, you're holding up that 9.5.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking to that dark ambient soundscape kind of thing, they whip up these clouds, that are, it almost sounds like what the weather is doing. And we've all heard and read about experiences that, the Grateful Dead how they were like playing to the weather or controlling the storm or whatever. And this is a band on stage. Phish has played in adverse weather conditions many, many times, even before this night, so they know when the wind is whipping up and the rain is coming down and the fans are out there screaming and going nuts along with them. This is not the time to play some quiet little song. Trey in particular is really whipping it up, and it just gets like murky and ugly and kind of crazy sounding. And on this particular occasion, you can then faintly hear him playing that Down with Disease guitar lick.
Yeah.
It starts to emerge out of these clouds of dark ambience. And they, like you said, they close it out. They come back to that Down with Disease theme. And it's incredible. It's incredible and totally unexpected. You're right.
And they play Prince Caspian. They segue sort of right into it. It picks up from, I would call it the ashes of Down with Disease. Like we're still
Yeah.
thinking about Down with Disease when they start
Yeah.
Prince Caspian. To me, I don't have a lot of notes for this. It seems kind of typical with soaring guitar notes, right? When I say
Mhm.
typical, that's not necessarily a pejorative. But most of the band is just vamping beneath a big guitar solo with the occasional amazing drum fill.
Yeah, totally. I feel like the Caspian itself doesn't really open up into much of anything. It is kind of, again, I referred to Rogue as being like subpar because it was dreamy textures and not much else. But you got coming out of that crazy Down with Disease, you get, it's like the dreamy textures reprise and it goes into Caspian like really peacefully. And the Trey's kind of guitar transition is really, I slept on this at first. I thought like, well, that Caspian isn't much, but the transition into it is really beautiful. And the transition out of it is really beautiful because it breaks down not quite like a full on like solo page on solo piano.
Oh, the Squirming Coil.
Yeah, thank you. It's not quite that kind of a coil outro with just Page, but this Caspian, the end of it does quiet down to this beautiful Page piano segment. And like you said, it goes right into You Enjoy Myself. You don't get that Caspian jam at the end where they just kind of pound back into that riff and usually kind of drag it out a little bit longer. Perhaps because of the weather, they knew like, okay, let's keep moving here. But it is an unexpected and a transition right into You Enjoy Myself.
Right, which is 28 minutes. The jam charts say that there were huge thunderstorms during it. I didn't hear anything during the track, during the audience recording,
Yeah.
but there are a pretty amazing bass and drums section, about 11 minutes and 30 seconds, and super bad teases. I don't think Trey can go more than 4 consecutive shows without playing the riff to super bad.
Right.
The more Phish I listen to, the more
Yeah.
super bad I hear, which is
Yeah.
not a bad thing. I would say, even though this track goes for nearly a half hour, I would describe it as a really long You Enjoy Myself with nothing I haven't heard before, but it must have been incredibly energizing to be there.
That's fair because listening back to it, that's your experience with it, and I think you're right as a listening experience. I don't know if fans are going to listen back to it and say this is the best YEM they've ever heard. The storm that was kind of the winds were picking up, the storm was coming and going. This is the part of the night where it really ramped up, and that orchestrated segment that opens the song and it goes into this kind of spooky ambient section. On this night, that stretched about 4 minutes, and it seemed extra long, really, for that part of the song that we all know well. But it also felt like a precursor to the coming storm because the rain was off and on through the second set, but only getting really crazy in this middle section of YEM where they, the drums and the bass jam turns into the band going into like a funk jam. And they get deep into it. But by the time, as you said, it's a 28, 29-minute version. By the time they get, they kind of naturally come around, as you and I have heard dozens of times. They kind of feel their way around to that point where it's time to get into that vocal jam to close out the tune. Some nights that goes on forever.
Or it feels like it.
And I'm not the biggest fan of the vocal jams. I'm really not, but this feels like a truncated vocal jam and likely due to the weather getting worse, almost to say like, let's wrap it up. Let's get out of here.
Yeah. And they do come back on for an encore of Character Zero. And I wonder if this pick of Character Zero, I mean, it's probably, aside from maybe Tweezer Reprise, I would guess the most encored song in Phish history. I wonder if this pick, though, is due because it's 8 minutes long, this character Zero, which is even on the shorter side, even though the song itself doesn't always have much to offer. I wonder if it's just kind of a mix of we have an obligation to play an encore, but it is dumping down, so we can't stick around and the fans can't stick around for much longer.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that the show was cut short because of the storm. And I think regardless of circumstances, there are very few shows throughout their career where they do a 3-song second set. Are you aware of any?
The only one I could think of, and I don't think it's 3 songs even, I can't remember the exact date, but it's Europe. It's in Amsterdam, 1996. They played a full 2-set show and they came on for what I think started as an encore, but they were all messed up. They were all some kinds of, drugged out. I don't know on what, who knows? It's Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And they started playing this third set that they just kind of bailed on right in the middle of it. So that's the only one I could think of. I can't think of another.
See, now I really want to hear that.
You kind of do, but you also kind of don't.
Yeah. Well, and I think, we're all glad that Trey got sober. We're all glad that he's not dead. You know what I mean? But I think in those days before Trey got sober, they had more of a tendency to kind of let themselves go, whether it was drug or alcohol fueled, I don't know or care. But in those days, there was a little bit of that kind of reckless abandon, like, let's just give ourselves over to the moment, the volume, the feedback, and whatever happens out there. Let's not try to control it.
And also for what it's worth, this show that I brought up, the Amsterdam show, the drugged out playing is more of like a fun goofing around with your friends in the basement doing psychedelics type of drugged out, what I mean, as opposed to the Phish in 2004 stumbling your way through a song and then playing with guitar pedals and staring out into space for 30 minutes drugged out. It's a more fun and like innocent.
That sounds like playing It Smells Like Teen Spirit after Dark Side of the Moon in its entirety.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that encore, I actually remember thinking, and I'm not the biggest fan of Character Zero, got to be honest. Like as a kid, as a young man, I wanted to get a guitar because I was so into Kiss and AC/DC, and I love this like caveman, simple, hard rock, 3-chord songs. I love that stuff, but it's not what I want to hear from Phish. And Character Zero is a song that like, that's a let's beat the traffic kind of encore for me. You know what I mean? Like, or if it's late in the first set, like, let's just go out to the lobby and get a beer now before there's a long line out there. But I remember thinking that it was irresponsible of them to play an encore. And you're right. There is a certain obligation to the crowd and just expectations when you go to a concert. What band doesn't play an encore? You know what I mean? So I'm sure they felt like they had to, but that storm was so bad. Playing another song, playing an encore is like asking 15,000 people to remain in harm's way during a storm of this magnitude, And I don't know, they might have been bumping up against local curfew laws. They couldn't take 5 for the storm to pass. I've had at least one experience where they started a set and they said, we got to stop until this passes. But I think that ship had sailed because it was too late in the night for that.
Well, I'm glad you made it to the red car. I'm glad your buddy made it to the red pickup truck.
Yeah.
And everyone got home safe because you lived to tell about it. So, Rick, thank you so much for taking the time, for being so prepared, and really bringing us back to the show as if we were there with you. That sounds a little bit different from what you would typically expect at a Phish show, and giving us some context of what it was like to be there July 1st, 1999 at the Starwood Amphitheater in Antioch/Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for being here and telling us your story.
Well, thanks for having me on, Brian. I'm a big fan of the show. It's an honor to be on. And like I said, this Nashville show is just the beginning of 6 shows that I saw in July. It's the only time in my life that I really had the freedom to kind of go on tour. I saw 3 shows early in July and 3 shows again at the end of the month. And it was just a very memorable time for me. And as I said, an honor to be on the show. I love the podcast, man.
And that's it for today's conversation with Ric Hickey. We threw around a lot of different dates, and there were quite a few estimates, but here on Attendance Bias, we have to have the facts.
Attendance Bias Fact Check.
My friend Tom Epps did join me for an episode of Attendance Bias where he told about attending a show at this same venue the following year, and I got the date correct. It was on June 22nd, 2000. On top of that, The episode about the June 21st, 1994 show at the Cincinnati Music Hall where the fire alarm went off with Kev Hollow aired on February 7th, 2024. Some more Phish and Cincinnati history. The two shows in 1999 were on December 3rd and 4th, and then there was the famous show at the Cincinnati Zoo that featured the long-awaited return of Slave to the Traffic Light after 2 years on the shelf. That show was played on August 6, 1993. According to Phish.com, the show was sold out and fans were allegedly trying to sneak into the show by jumping through the pen of 120-pound flesh-eating Komodo dragons. If you're one of those fans, please get in touch immediately. I was right that Derek Trucks came out to join Phish on stage about 2 years ago, but it was definitely not in Georgia. Instead, it was at SPAC in Saratoga Springs on August 26, 2023. During our conversation, I called Roguet a relatively new song, and I suggested that it's possible many fans at this Nashville show hadn't yet heard it. Roguet debuted on June 30th, 1998 at the Grey Hall in Copenhagen. So it's almost a year to the date since its debut. Today, in 2025, it might sound insane for a Phish song to be unheard by fans after being around for a year. But remember, at this time in 1999, file sharing was basically in its infancy, and not everyone had access to high-speed internet, and many fans also did not have direct access to the tape trading community. Anyway, no one asked, but I stand by my statement. When Rick asks about other shows with 3-song second sets, I mentioned that Amsterdam 1996 at the Melkweg is a possible contender. Well, that show was played on June 12th, 1996, and it has been covered on Attendance Bias with guest Jeff Somar. And yes, the band came on for a third set where they made it through just 3 songs, David Bowie, Free, and Hello My Baby, before getting off stage. And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Ric Hickey for joining me today, Phish.net for their help with the fact check, Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode, and the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do to help with music education. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, you can always support the show by following us on social media, and you can support the show as well by visiting www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donating anything you can. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.